I do think Crystal Dunn is making this roster, but here is my just overall question, which is just, I do think that Crystal Dunn has gone from a position where the U.S. did not have a lot of depth to a position where they have a ton of depth. I think it's interesting that Dunn is kind of getting this late career validation of what she can bring in other areas to the team, but I do think it legitimately puts her in a more tight race, a more difficult race to make this roster. I think she is going to make this roster for all of those things that I just said. I think her versatility and her ability to be effective in the front line. But it just feels kind of ironic to me that there has been a big push for Dunn to finally get to move into the spaces of the field where she feels most comfortable. And I am very happy to see it. I think it's kind of ironic. It is kind of coming at this angle of, well, suddenly she's in this very long line of wingers that we know are very talented for the United States. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Monday, June 3rd, and wow, do we have much to discuss. International soccer, the U.S. is on the right track as they move towards the Olympics. And we saw some emotions flare in the WNBA as the league continues to morph and grow and turn into something new, and we will get into all of it right now. All right, today we are going to start with the U.S. women's national team. We have started off the Emma Hayes era with a bang. They have played their first game under their new manager full time. They won 4-0 over South Korea in front of a sold-out crowd in Denver on Saturday. This has kind of been like a slow-moving process. I think probably people have followed even this podcast or followed JWS coverage. You know, there was the roster that was announced a couple weeks ago. Hayes was not yet full-time in the role, so we did not get a lot of feedback from Hayes herself on that roster construction. Then we move into her official announcement, or perhaps like debut or initial press as the head coach. Still not really talking roster that much. Did a kind of a media blitz in New York before heading to join the team in camp. We had one press conference with Hayes before the game. Obviously, there was post-game after. So not a lot of super deep insight into the roster before we saw this game. I do think we can come to some conclusions after watching this game. I think everyone knows there is only one more friendly left before Hayes names her Olympic 18. I don't mind this too much. I think obviously a coach coming in, it's not probably wise to be talking big roster stuff right away. She wants to get to know his players. She wants to see tendencies. She wants to see fitness. Doesn't want to make any too big, huge declarative statements about the team before really getting to know them. And that's also very Hayes. Hayes likes to put kind of the people first. She likes to be more of a person-centric coaching style, which I actually think is a great fit for an international team, where it's a lot about the relationship building and the personality building and putting players in a position to succeed rather than any sort of day in, day out tactical stuff. So didn't mind this too much, but I'm going to be honest, a lot of the analysis that you've probably seen from other people and will see from me today is more just about our impressions of what we saw from the game, because we have not gotten a ton of insight from Hayes herself about what she's thinking going into the Olympics. So great game, by the way. I was going to say this is a nice one to cover because I think we saw some marginal games sort of tactically with how the team would like to play under Hayes. She's not reinventing the wheel. We're also seeing some players as we move further into the sports calendar kind of moving into form. Lovely game. They win 4-0 over South Korea. Swanson scores a brace. It's her first 2 goals since returning to the team following her serious knee injury last year. 1 assist was from Sophia Smith. 1 assist was from Rose Lavelle. Tierna Davidson, center back, also scores a brace in this one, both off of corner kicks. 1 assist from Katarina Macario and 1 assist from Swanson. So it was a nicely balanced attacking performance from the team where, yes, you want to be seeing those nice combination plays that lead to goals, but you also want to see them being able to punch the ball in on set pieces, which is going to be crucial to Olympic success, as set pieces tend to be for any tournament. Even when you're not playing at your best, even when the goals aren't coming necessarily, you need to be able to punch it in from set pieces, and that's something that the U.S. really struggled with last year. So let's talk about the good. There was a lot of good. I really liked the way the team moved the ball through the spine of the midfield, something they were missing in previous years. I think people remember sometimes in the Vladko era, the team would feel like there was this gap, right, between the back line, maybe the defensive midfield, and then the attacking midfield and the forwards. They would be lining up 4 or 5 up on another team's back line. It was not connective. It was a lot more long ball passing. It was a lot more kicking the ball out wide, sending crosses in. They score 2 goals. Those 2 Swanson goals that they score in this game come up the spine of the midfield. That is a big deal. Don't know if it's replicable. We'll see if this turns into something that they can do under Hayes regularly, but that is really, really nice to see. Also thought that the finishing and the final ball through were appropriately sharp for where we are in the sports calendar. It's a push-pull sometimes that many of the U.S. women's national team players play in the NWSL. I know that with Hayes coming in a discussion after the sort of disappointing World Cup last year was this idea of you do want diversity of experience, right? You probably want a good mix of NWSL versus players who are playing in Europe. You want to have players who can play different styles, play against different competition. But there is sort of this underrated factor that, yeah, the starting front line, which was Smith, Swanson, and Rodman, are all played in through NWSL right now. Even a player like Lindsey Horan has the benefit of the fact that she played in the Champions League final last week. These players are played in, they're played into form. They will be continuing to play games before they go into camp. You don't want to overload. And I understand that. I think that there's a lot of concern about over programming, but there is also a benefit structure to having players be a little bit sharper. Those 2 strikes from Swanson, I think, are a really good example. That's a player that just actually rejoined the ranks of professional soccer this year after spending last year rehabbing an injury. She's been playing for Chicago regularly since March. We're seeing the dividends of that. Really nice. I also liked that the team looked comfortable kind of playing more probing, attacking football with Korea Republic playing in sort of a low to mid block. They didn't get pulled into those big midfield gaps. The midfield itself was not set up to be super conservative or overly attacking without thinking about build-up play. There was not an over-reliance on the central defenders to send diagonal balls up for the attack to chase. I liked that they had a plan specifically for breaking down the low to mid block because, as we know, the U.S. plays 2 types of games, right? They play high transition, but that usually only happens when they're playing against top tier opponents. And then they also have teams that they have to break now. Now, to be clear, I'm not entirely sure how many mid to low blocks are going to see in the Olympics. I've said this before. These are 12 really good teams who are going to come out with their own attacking game plans to strike against the U.S. rather than just trying to hold on against the U.S. So it's good that the U.S. can do this, and I think South Korea is actually great pre-tournament competition. They've played them, I think they played them before the 2015 World Cup. They do like to play them in these Olympic or World Cup years because they do present interesting defensive assignments that they have to break down. Liked it a lot. But I think also, big picture, we do want to see the team playing well, but we can't pretend that this is not also mostly an evaluation period for who's going to be making that 18-player Olympic roster. So let's talk about who started in this game. The starting lineup: Jane Campbell in goal, Emily Fox, Naomi Girma, Tierna Davidson, and Jenna Nyswanger in the defense, Sam Coffey, Lindsey Horan, and Katerina Macario in the midfield, Trinity Rodman, Sophia Smith, and Mallory Swanson up top. I do actually think this is close, if not exactly, the type of group Hayes might want to start in an Olympic match. I really do think that. Obviously, Alyssa Nair it's not available for this camp due to injury. She's going to be in the mix there. Hayes also spoke about how Alex Morgan was dealing with some tightness on her pelvic floor, didn't want to mess with that. The U.S. plays tonight as well. You'll probably see Morgan play in that game. But I do think that this is the mix of actual starters that she is considering for the Olympics. I said this the last time we talked about the U.S. This was on the YouTube exclusive mini episode. I think with the Olympics, you kind of have to give up the idea of set starters and set reserves. There's very little break in between games. There's a lot of travel. One of the challenges of the tournament itself is kind of how to manage that revolving door of fitness so that you aren't burnt out by the end of the tournament. We've actually seen other countries struggle with that, specifically Sweden. I think we've all seen Sweden look really, really good in the Olympics at the beginning. By the time they reach the end, they are out of gas. And I think the U.S. is looking at the long game as well as the short. So when I say starters, when I say reserves, I do think that you have to think of it kind of twofold. Yes, there are going to be certain combinations of players that Hayes wants to put out there, but anyone coming off the bench is probably going to be making a similar impact and probably will also be considered for starting in the next game because the games are so fast and furious. I think Jane Campbell, well-earned start. She's one of the best goalkeepers in the NWSL in both recent years, and I would also say this season. I thought she did fine. I think the U.S. is still stuck in this, and maybe I'm contradicting myself. I wish the U.S. were in more of a revolving door mindset with the goalkeeper situation instead of having this very set starter and a very set of backups. She wasn't super tested in this game. She did have a couple moments where it seemed like it was a little nervy. She had one save that, or one time she had the ball in her hands where it seemed a little bit like her eyes were scanning before she had set it. She had one moment with her feet where the ball kind of got past her. It didn't really matter because South Korea was not pressuring, but I worry about the mental game. I think being the U.S. women's national team goalkeeper is huge, mostly just in terms of having your mental game in the right spot. and they don't really give their backups enough time to gel, calm down, get comfortable back there. Maybe it's fine because Nair comes back, but we have seen sort of uncharacteristic stuff from Murphy back in goal for the U.S. We've seen some uncharacteristic stuff from Campbell. So I am curious about what the philosophy is for that role if they do see a player other than Nair playing in the Olympics, and what they are willing to kind of give up while understanding that, yeah, these players maybe look a little bit nervy, but that's because of the development process, not some failing of the player themselves. Thought the back line looked excellent. Gurma looked fit, which I think was a recent concern. Davidson also obviously had a great match. I always laugh a little thinking about how goals from defenders are sort of enveloped into a full, like a player's resume when you're picking a roster. Like, I don't think Tierna Davidson is going to make this roster because they're like, yes, and she's a huge asset on set pieces. These 2 goals took her total U.S. Women's National Team goal career to 3. But they have to be happy that her positioning is good on set pieces, right? I think this happens sometimes too, like with Sam Coffey. Sam Coffey has scored a couple bangers for the U.S. and everyone goes, yes, Sam Coffey, this is great for her. And I'm like, yes, it is. But maybe they're more focused on what she does in defensive transition rather than her shots from distance, though it's always nice to have that. So I always laugh a little bit when we talk about these defensive players scoring, because yes, it means that the set piece construction is working. It means that the dead ball delivery is very good. And it means that people are following their assignments. But I'm like, yeah, she had a great game, but she also defended very well, is my point. Emily Fox was tasked with staying home. Will Niswanger played more a little bit attacking outside. So Fox had a quiet game, but that was by design. Niswanger combined in the attack a lot more, also by design. Niswanger seems truly to be an option for outside back more and more for the U.S. starting in this back line. I think it's sort of that push-pull again of probably some liabilities in defensive transition, but what she brings to the attack is so important. I really like that she's settling in there. I like that her club team has supported her in this position shift. And I think it feels good. And again, we'll talk about what that means for a player like Crystal Dunn. But I like that. I like that combination that they're getting, especially between, I saw Macario and Niswanger combined really nicely in this game. The midfield, like I said, wasn't too conservative, which I really liked. Sam Coffey was in the defensive midfield. Haran more as the number 8, which was kind of a lost art in the Vlatko years. Usually Haran was either sitting back more in a defensive midfield or she was pushing into the box, trying to add another attacker. You do need connective tissue to your midfield. I liked that Haran was playing that role. And I thought Macario was fantastic at the 10. I think Macario is still working her way back into gelling with the national team. This was her first start in over 2 years. That will come. But I keep saying it, dead ball delivery. Like, what Macario brings on dead balls, particularly corner kicks and free kick situations, is so important to, like I said, punching a goal in, maybe late in a game, you're chasing a game. Macario, as she works into, again, to that more connective tissue, I think we're going to see more from her. But immediately she takes the U.S. to another level on dead ball, and I think that that's fantastic. And I think that that's the kind of player that you bring for that alone, because that gets you wins. Thought the attack also great. Rodman, Smith, Swanson, dream. Swanson looked sharp. Smith looked more pass first, which was incredible. Sometimes she gets knocked for being a little bit more dribble first, goals, scoring second, maybe passing third. Loved that assist from Smith. Love that connective tissue there for her as the number 9. And I thought Swanson's finishing was fantastic. Mal Swanson plays soccer like she's in the Matrix. Everything is just slower for her. She makes decisions faster. She makes runs faster than other people. And usually what slows her down is people not necessarily always being on the same page. And I think you could even see it. Her celebrations, yes, we're happy because she loves scoring goals. She loves being back with the U.S. Women's National Team. But you could also just feel how happy she is when a good plan comes together. And when she makes the run and her teammate sees her making that run or even anticipates that run and finds her so she can just slot it into the back of the net. That's the good stuff. That's what you want to see from the United States. Thought the subs were interesting. Lavelle came in and made an impact. Really like to see that. I kind of don't hate her as a weapon off the bench. I like that. Shaw comes in for Smith. Would love to see Shaw get more time this evening. She's maybe the final piece of this mix that I think Hayes has to be careful to get right. She could play in a lot of different positions. To me, she has to be on this team. This was not her game, quote unquote, but I think that is maybe the player coming off the bench that I go, okay, but how do you work Shaw into this mix? And Sam Staub came in for her first U.S. cap and I think did a perfectly good job off the bench. So I think they've got a nice group right now. But my final question about the U.S., and I'm curious what everyone thinks about this. Crystal Dunn comes into this game off the bench, and she comes in for Rodman, and she comes in as a winger. Now, she was listed as a forward going into this camp, certainly played like one on Saturday. We know she can play wide pretty much anywhere on the field. She can do outside back. She can play outside midfield. She can play more of a wing back, more of a winger. She can play on the outside. We also know she can play centrally in the midfield. She's done that for numerous teams. We didn't see her really playing winger that much, though, prior to 2024. That it feels like an old project and yet a new one. I do think Crystal Dunn is making this roster, but here is my just overall question, which is just, I do think that Crystal Dunn has gone from a position where the U.S. did not have a lot of depth to a position where they have a ton of depth. We were talking about this last year all the time, right? The depth at winger for the United States, the depth at forward for the United States. We talked about this when Lynn Williams was left off of this roster, despite kind of just being the exact same player that she's always been. I think it's interesting that Dunn is kind of getting this late career validation of what she can bring in other areas to the team, but I do think it legitimately puts her in a more tight race, a more difficult race to make this roster. I think she is going to make this roster for all of those things that I just said. I think her versatility and her ability to be effective in the front line. But it just feels kind of ironic to me that there has been a big push for Dunn to finally get to move into the spaces of the field where she feels most comfortable. And I am very happy to see it. I think it's kind of ironic. It is kind of coming at this angle of, well, suddenly she's in this very long line of wingers that we know are very talented for the United States. So yeah, great game. I think Hayes should feel really good about it. I'm really interested to see what we get from the team this evening in their second friendly. And then it's crunch time. Then it's roster time, Olympic roster time. I'm going to stick with kind of what I said last time, which is barring injury, I do think this group of 23 is where the 18 is going to come from, except I'm curious about the midfield. I do think the midfield possibly could see an outlier brought in. Because here's kind of what I'm thinking after this first game. We're going to do analysis of the second game as well. But so I'm thinking, Nair has to feel really good as long as she's fit. Campbell, I actually think, has to feel really good about pole position for the backup spot, just based on NWSL play. And just sort of, again, she can definitely come in and be capable as a backup. You still have Murphy and Kingsbury in the mix for sure. Defense, Girma and Davidson, absolutely. Niswanger. I do think Sonnet, again, she can play on multiple lines. I would be interested to see her in the midfield in this game tonight. Fox, I actually feel pretty good about Casey Kruger, like her in this. And then I think you kind of have that big list of center backs waiting in the wings. Staub, Dahlkemper, Sauerbrunn. They have many center backs that could slot in if they need to. But because they kind of like Sonnet there, it's possible that three will be Girma, Davidson, and Sonnet. Midfield, I think, is a bigger question mark. Feel good about Coffey, Horan, Macario, Lavelle. But is there another role? Is there a fifth midfielder role that gets filled? Is it Corbin Albert, who, I'm going to be completely honest, I don't think she's really shown something that makes me feel like she is the only other number 8 option for the team. And there's also just so much other attacking midfield talent. You've got someone like Croy Bethune waiting in the wings. You still got Andy Sullivan, who could help in the defensive midfield. What is that connective tissue that you want to build in the midfield? I'm curious to see if they maybe add another attacker that can play in the midfield and take 4 midfielders, or if they take 5. Very curious to see how that goes. And then front line, you got to feel good about Morgan, Shaw, Smith, Swanson. Do feel good about Dunn, but like I said, that's taking a spot that like maybe could go in the midfield. But also Dunn can go in the midfield. Shaw can go in the midfield. What is the ultimate tactical goal? That's going to be interesting to follow as well. I do think, unfortunately for someone like Lynn Williams, this game went so well with plan A that I don't know if Hayes at this moment is thinking about plan B. Very curious to see what happens if Alex Morgan gets more time in the second game, if they do feel like there is some wiggle room in what the rotation looks like in that central or wide attack. But the good news for fans is that the U.S. looks great, and the bad news for fans of players who did not play in this game is that the U.S. looks great. So very fascinated to see how this plays out. But yeah, we'll get more into sort of Olympic roster analysis later. But yeah, just final thoughts on this is that a very good opening for Hayes. I think that Korea asked some very interesting questions. I think they were answered by the United States, and they should feel really good about this mix going into this final game, and then also making that Olympic roster decision. Okay, moving from the world of soccer where the vibes are good and people are happy and bopping and having a good time, to the WNBA where things feel maybe a little bit less fun sometimes. I'm like, are we having fun? Are we having fun in the WNBA? It's interesting. It's exciting. It's heated. It's competitive. But is it fun? I think that's the ultimate question for this week for the WNBA. So I actually went to the game between Indiana and Chicago that took place over the weekend. It was aired on ESPN. It was a very close game. The Fever win this 71-70. Obviously, the conversation of this game has extended far past X's and O's, and we will get into that later, but I do want to do a quick roundup before we talk about that sort of big story coming out of the weekend. I want to say, shout out the Connecticut Sun, who are 8-0. They are the only team left unbeaten in the WNBA. They are only the 7th team in league history to reach that mark of 8-0. And every single one of those teams who did start 8-0 went on to at least make the WNBA finals that year. So Connecticut, I think we've seen some stuff from the Aces. There are some questions. We've seen some stuff from the Liberty where there are some questions. Maybe the Sun are the best team in the WNBA right now. I don't think that's that crazy to say. The Storm have rattled off a 4-game win streak. Also interesting. They are a team that's figuring out how to gel. Good win streak from them. Phoenix, these are like the 2 big free agent teams. Phoenix lost 4 in a row before beating LA on Sunday. So I think these 2 teams might be a little streaky. I think that they are still figuring some things out. But it was interesting to kind of see the Storm rise after a bit of a rough start, see Phoenix kind of drop off after a stronger start. The Aces still kind of need to get into a groove. They've only played 6 games so far, which can be helpful for fitness and practice, but I actually think is messing with their game flow. They're 4-2. I still think Asia Wilson is the MVP front runner, but would just like to see more games from the Aces, and I'm sure they're ready to get going as well. The Liberty are a lot better than the Indiana Fever. That's like my takeaway from this week and last week. They're still figuring stuff out too, but they've already played 3 games against the Fever and beat them soundly every single time. So interesting scheduling balance there. Dallas and Atlanta kind of remain enigmas to me. Would love more definitive stuff from them, but they are just so firmly planted in that sort of mid-table range. And I think they've had some good performances. They've had some rougher ones. They've had some ups and downs. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see if we can find some real definitive narratives for Dallas and Atlanta. And then the Lynx still look great. And the player I want to shout out, actually, I have 2 Minnesota players that I think people should be paying attention to. One is Kayla McBride, who has been excellent for the Lynx. I like McBride a lot. She's a player who moved on from the Aces kind of right as the Aces were starting their sort of ascendancy into that back-to-back sort of juggernaut. But I think that she is a player that could have been on that team and done quite well. I like to see her seeing the success in Minnesota. And then also 2024 first round draft pick Alyssa Pilley had her first breakout game. She scores 20 points on Friday. Happy to see that as well. But we probably need to get into what I think is going to be perhaps one of the more interesting rivalries of the season. Fireworks to start. Chicago versus Indiana. Can we get like a hell is real type rivalry going? The hell is real sign on I-65. People call it like the I-65 Derby. They call it the I-65 rivalry. Again, you got the big hell is real sign. And maybe that's the vibe, because we're going to be talking about Chicago versus Indiana, but we're also kind of going to be talking about Chicago and Indiana versus like the world. Things got heated. The Fever, for example, have played a stretch of games where they have played 11 games in 20 days. The first 20 days of the WNBA season, 11 games for the Fever. A ridiculous stretch that has inhibited not only their ability to improve, which I actually think a lot of neutrals would like to see. I think they would like to see Indiana continue to improve with how many exciting young players they have. But it also has kind of made some of the big feelings coming out of this game felt accumulative in the way of like, yeah, if you're playing 11 games in 20 days, everything is just going to start to feel like a wave, right? Where every bump, every bruise, every frustration, it's just game after game after game. And so even if you're looking at individual instances of things that are happening to the Fever or by the Fever, for them, they have to just feel like, oh my gosh, the hits just keep on coming. I think that this was a really rough start to the season for them. I said this actually at the game. I'm really excited to see Indiana like post-Olympic break. Let them cook a little bit, let them practice, let them gel. But I do think that when things start to feel a little bit more emotional, a little bit more heated, I'm like, yeah, they're tired. And every little thing starts to feel bigger and bigger and accumulative over time. So what I'm referring to, and I'm going to start big picture before diving into the specifics of this game, is this larger discussion about Caitlin Clark and the physicality of the WNBA. This is a conversation that started before Clark even joined the WNBA. There were some warning signs, right, from some veterans that the way the game is played in the dub is going to be a next level of physicality, a next level of obviously athleticism, right? You know, there's no college team that is as good as even the worst WNBA team, right? So the next level of athleticism, of strength, and yes, of physicality has been something that has impacted Clark. And like I said, I keep saying 11 games in 20 days. All of it starts to feel bigger. But here's my philosophical question about this. And this is something that I've brought up in soccer as well. And I think maybe a good caveat for like my perspective on this is people know me as a soccer writer, NWSL writer, US Women's National Team writer. I like come from the NWSL Thunderdome on this one. The NWSL is another very physical league that sometimes does veer into not protecting their players enough through the officiating beyond even who wins each game. I don't think it's good, but I will add my voice to the chorus that says it is not new. This is not new. It is simply a fact about women's sports, whether you can blame the level of officiating. I think there are many kind of solutions, but I also think, again, it's in the DNA. People credit the NWSL for being a fast physical league. People credit the WNBA for being a fast physical league. It makes them unique in the sports landscape beyond just sort of having these eternal factors as to why that is this way. But I also always feel like the rules of the game, whether it be basketball or soccer, don't always work in favor of protecting individual players. There are always punishments, right, for one player committing a lot of fouls or committing one big foul or doing something that is out of character or beyond the rules of the game. But there is a less of a cohesive game plan for when one person is drawing a lot of fouls or being hit with a lot of common fouls, let's say, right? You do see it in soccer all the time, right? Refs don't want to give yellow cards to first offenses. Every time you see a defender go in for a hard tackle and they get a yellow, they're like, they put their finger up and they go, but it's my first foul. It's my first foul. It's not a big deal. But what happens and what refs have to deal with in sort of the emotions of the game and how to manage a game beyond just sort of like, again, the X's and O's or the rules is what if everyone's first offense is just on one particular player, right? What if one team's defensive game plan is that no one's going to foul a lot. They're not going to do anything individually that are beyond the rules of the game, but everything they do is just kind of focused around one player. And all of those fouls are normal. You call them, player either gets free throws or, in soccer, you get free kicks, but it does become accumulative. And one of the additional burdens on a referee or an official is to figure out how to manage that emotion of it without being overly punitive on either side. Basketball games are not always super fun when they're played really, really tightly. Nobody really likes that. It feels like the refs are inserting them into the conversation. But also maybe like we saw in that game against Indiana or that game against Chicago or some of those other Indiana games, if you just actually have to set a high watermark for what a foul is for any player, lest they give one player all the calls, then emotions run high, physicality runs high, and that's how you get into some of these sort of big fouls that have gone viral after the game. I think we saw that again in Chicago versus Connecticut. We talked about that on this show. Or maybe they do just give one player all the calls. Sometimes just what is happening is what is happening. People foul one player a lot. That player gets to the line a lot. They score a lot of free throws. And that over time encourages teams to stop fouling that player because it hurts them on the other end. Same thing with like penalty kicks in soccer, right? So there are different ways to manage this beyond just, oh, this was my first foul, or, oh, no one fouled out, but they're all kind of hitting this one player, right? Now, I think this is happening to Caitlin Clark because she is one of the most lethal players on this team. I was not willing to talk about intent for Alyssa Thomas. I'm also not willing to do it here. What I am referring to is when Kennedy Carter of the Chicago Sky bumps Caitlin Clark while the ball was still out of bounds in the third quarter of the Sky's loss on Saturday. It was an out of bounds play. It was not a basketball play. It was intentional. Kennedy Carter had words for Clark before she did it. It was considered obviously an out of bounds foul call, which what happens when that occurs is the other player gets one free throw and the team gets the ball back. The play was not reviewed, which I think there was a lot of frustration about, rightfully so. It was later given a flagrant one the day after once the play was reviewed post-game. Clark should have had one more free throw, should have been a flagrant one, which also would have put a point against Carter's record in terms of accumulation towards a suspension. All things considered, again, like I said, I was there. Really probably for the best that the game did not go into OT. There was a possibility of that at the very, very end of this game. Indiana only wins by 1. I think if the game had gone into overtime, if Chicago had found a way maybe to win in overtime, we'd be having a competitive conversation, which feels like the refs really got that wrong. And that affected Indiana. I think, again, just in the larger sort of ball don't lie conversation, very happy that Indiana won this game 71-70. I think the response after the game was sort of twofold, right? It was not a basketball play. It was not cool by Carter. But Clark is also, again, just dealing with this accumulative frustration. The schedule being targeted tactically as one of the more lethal players on her team. She's also the person who brings the ball up. She was getting doubled all night. Yes, players are going to want to jostle her, but it's about winning basketball games because they see her as the point of attack for the Indiana Fever. Again, I think if people watched the game, you could see actually the downside of that approach. Chicago was really focused on Clark, and they lost because Alyssa Smith played really well, because Kelsey Mitchell played really well. They had cuts, back-end cuts that they were not tracking because they were overly focused on Clark. And also the person I think was supposed to be guarding Clark in that game didn't even play. Diamond DeShields was a late scratch due to feeling sick that day, and I think the Sky were forced into this rotational defense that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. Michaela Onyewere starts the game. She's on Clark first. She does fine, but then other defensive assignments were not picked up. Then they put Marina Mabry on Clark when Marina Mabry was in the game. And then later, as Carter, who actually played very well off the bench, got more minutes late game because she was the hot hand, they had Carter on Clark. And I kind of feel, again, the same way about this as I did about Alyssa Thomas on Angel Reese. Clark is kind of chatty. She gets in people's heads. She's a big competitor. She falls when she feels contact because that's smart basketball. And also frequently a good way to avoid injury. If you let the contact move through you, you let the momentum move rather than trying to push against it all the time. And she's exhausted. And Indiana was throughout this game finally in a game that it felt like they could win. The emotion in that arena was Indiana has this if they can just keep doing what they're doing. So again, it's like you have to look at it as, yes, Clark is drawing these calls. Yes, Clark probably should be drawing more of them. But that's just smart basketball from Clark. She's goading other players into she gets into their head a little bit, and these things happen. Indiana wins by 1 after getting a free throw and the ball back. I think the Sky should probably feel not very good about this game because they only scored 70 points against an Indiana team that keeps having, 100-point performances dropped on them. The overfocus on Clark did not really work. They got burned by other players on the team. Aaliyah Boston played really well against the Sky's rotation of bigs, which actually included Camila Cardoso, who looked very good actually in her limited minutes. So the Sky should feel good about that. They got outpaced from tempo. They didn't shoot well from 3. And if they don't want to be a lottery team in the fall, they have other things that they got to be working on. And I also think genuinely that Carter could be a 6th player of the year candidate if she can figure that mental part of her game out without sort of that inappropriate contact, without letting the game get to her. So all to say, I'm very happy that the Fever are going to have fewer games this week. They do not play again until Friday. I think that Chicago and Indiana have something really interesting cooking here. They are close regionally. They have many large stars who are very young. They are going to be seeing a lot of each other in the coming years. This should be fun. It should be competitive. The fouls should be reasonable, as should the officiating and the way that teams respond. And I think that my hope is that if this is a growing pain with the way that we talk about this, or even again, how it's officiated, how consequences are doled out, or even how players handle focusing so much on a player like Clark. Again, you see someone like Diana Taurasi over the years. People got goaded into that. You see a player like Candace Parker over the years. People get goaded into that. You saw Angel Reese last week, 2 weeks ago. A player got goaded into a bad play. And that is part of the game. And I think that the Sky should feel bad that they got pulled into that. But that's what builds rivalries going forward. Clark is fine. And now she gets a couple of days off. So my hope overall is I think for the dub, and certainly trying to keep up with as much as possible. I think is difficult when people are trying to cover things league wide and you do have sort of these North Star players that people are very interested in, is just what does the big picture look like, but then also what just happened in the moment. And I think that Chicago Sky Indiana Fever game was a really good example of that. It was a fantastic atmosphere, to be honest. It was sold out. Fans were into it. I thought it was a nice amount of cheering for both. There was a fan. This is my last little anecdote. There was a fan at this game who had a T-shirt on, and the T-shirt, it was like a airbrushed T-shirt, and it said "Basketball Queens." And the 3 players on that shirt were Camila Cardoso, Angel Reese, and Caitlin Clark. People are excited about these players. People are learning, again, some of these overall things that have been going on in the league for a long time, good or bad. It just kind of is a reality of it. And I'm excited, hopefully, for what this young core of these 2 teams can do in the future. Hopefully, let's keep it clean, keep it basketball related. But just, yeah, an interesting high point. Interested to see how it continues throughout the week. Happy for Indiana. Chicago's got some stuff to work on. And then we move on to next week. We got a lot of games coming up this week, which will be equally interesting. So I'll just do a quick roundup of some of the other news this week. I think the big one that people have been following is the Women's College World Series softball. We are again recording this on Monday. This will be slightly obsolete when it is released on Tuesday, but you do have the 4 semifinalists, which are Florida, Stanford, Oklahoma, and Texas. Y'all can mark me on it. I would love to see some upsets here, but I would not be surprised if the finals were not Texas and Oklahoma for it all. Excited to see where that goes. And the other thing I kind of was following this weekend was Simone Biles at the U.S. Gymnastics Championships. Another excellent meet from her. She put together an incredible first day score, miles ahead of the competition. She actually did have a stumble on her vault in the second day. Didn't matter. Handily wins the U.S. championships. This is the last meet before the Olympic trials. She is anticipated to be the winner of that as well. Love the Simone Biles comeback trail, and we will be talking about her more as we get into Olympics coverage, but happy to see. And that is going to be a tough team for the U.S. to pick. There are a lot of specialists. There are a lot of returning Olympians who would like to make the team. And it's a very cool moment in gymnastics, I hope, where we are seeing careers get longer. We are seeing excellence persevere. And we are seeing an understanding of kind of both the mental, emotional, and physical game that is being a gymnastics athlete. So very, very, very cool to see that as well. So this has been this week's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. Keep an eye on what we're doing in newsletter and YouTube and socials. We might have more Late Sub coming up for you next week, or this week, actually. We might have more Late Sub coming up for you this week because it is a packed week of both basketball and international soccer action. And we will see you next time with a lot of good stuff.